Hello, welcome everyone to the Business and Society 2020-2021 series. I'm Jerry Davis, Professor of Management at the Ross School. And today I'm the host, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our event. The event today focuses on exploring diversity, equity, and inclusion through CEO activism. We're delighted to be joined by four panelists who bring a rich, diverse set of insights and experiences to this topic. Brenda Pack is a recent Ross MBA alum, co-founder of Backpack Social Activism, which is a social enterprise incubated right here at Ross. So welcome back, Brenda. Brett Hart is an LSA alum. Like myself, he majored in philosophy. Unlike myself, he found gainful employment. He's currently the president of United Airlines in what must be the most exciting year ever in airline history. So welcome back, Brett. Mark Kennedy is also a Ross MBA alum, former chief financial officer, congressional representative from Minnesota, and currently president of the University of Colorado. So he brings experiences from business, politics, academia to this issue. So welcome back, Mark. And Nicole Jordan is the chief operating officer of Remix Software. She also has extensive nonprofit experience. She doesn't have a Michigan degree yet, like the other panelists, but I am highly optimistic that we will get her on board in the not too distant future. So I want to set a little context for what we're up to today. This past year has been like no other year that I know of. Events have raised the stakes and the urgency of the movement for racial equity at work. Have created new opportunities for executives at the top and also social intrapreneurs at the bottom to advocate for change in their organizations. The killing of George Floyd on May 25th, on top of so much else, precipitated an unprecedented level of activism around racial justice over the past few months, both in the public square, but also in workplaces. Businesses responded in different ways. Some did nothing. Some put out a discreet BLM logo on their homepage, and others were pretty forthright and declared themselves not just EEO employers, but anti-racist organizations. There's a lot of variation out there in how businesses are responding and at what level it's happening. From the grassroots level to the CEO level, we're seeing political and social activism that would have been pretty unthinkable even just 10 years ago. And it creates interesting opportunities for employees. So you may not know that the Ross School is home to the world's first MBA course on social entrepreneurship. So we've been at this for 10 years now, sending MBAs as activists out there into the business world. So that's a little bit of teeing up what we're up to today. To give you an overview of the format of the event, we had an amazing response from all of you. This is one of the largest events, certainly that I've seen at the Ross School. We got about 100 questions from all of you. And so our dialogue today is really going to be driven by the questions that you all sent in. And we've tried to organize them into a bit of a narrative arc. We've also set the Q&A feature. So please feel free to put any questions you might have into the Q&A feature. If there's time at the end, we will get to those. If there isn't time, we'll be able to draw on those in the future for additional discussions down the road. So before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves, I want to launch a poll that I'm asking all of you to respond to. And this will help us kick off this first conversation. So the question is, how confident are you in the business world's ability to make social change? From not at all confident to completely confident. Go ahead and answer and submit those, and we'll compile them and then get back to you. While we are compiling these results, I wanted to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves in their current role and to share something from their early career that that shaped their own approach to activism at work. So it might be an injustice you experienced, or an issue that you took on, or a role model, or it might be just something else that was meaningful that got you to where you are today. So Brenda, I wonder if we could start with you. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I'm Brenda. I am the CEO and founder of Backpack, as Sherry mentioned. We are a one-stop social impact hub where you can come and donate to your favorite causes, volunteer with your favorite orgs, and buy socially conscious products. if there's one experience that has shaped my DEI journey, it would be a few years back. I was at a firm that had put together a council that was wanting to strategize around diversity and inclusion and really implement that within the firm. So publicly, everyone was very much on board. They were very supportive, but in the day-to-day, it was very different. I would get a lot of remarks from my male colleagues saying that, oh, of course you got nominated, you're a woman, you have a lot of soft skills. So, they want a more feminine touch. They want you to talk about your feelings, and you're good at talking about other people's feelings. So that's why they nominated you. And so day to day, I got those comments. And then when roadblocks would come up on projects that I was a part of, the leadership would actually make comments like, you're not prioritizing your work. The reason why we're hitting these challenges is because you're not focused, you're distracted. You need to know, what is important and what's not. And so I felt like I was very indirectly dinged for my participation in this council. And it's when I learned that it's not just about words, it really is about action from everyone, and everyone needs to be bought into this vision. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Brett, how about you?
Thanks, Jerry. And thanks for having me here today. As you mentioned, I'm president of United Airlines. I actually started my career as a lawyer and joined United Airlines as the general counsel. But having started my career as a lawyer, I started right after law school at a large law firm and a class of about 30, and probably I think 4 people of color in that starting class. And we all just started out doing the work that we were given and following the process. And I put my head down and I worked hard. And when I lifted my head up 2.5 years later, it was very clear to me that the experience that I'd had was very different from many of the other of my classmates. And in fact, the other people of color were no longer with the firm. And so what I learned from that experience is that you have to be active in managing your career. You have to be active in assisting others in managing their career. And from that point forward, it was no more from a professional perspective approaching things with a head down. It was being very deliberate, being active, being engaged, and ensuring that my experience matched the experience of others, and that as many people as I could impact in the organization who were in a similar position also had the same experience.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole Jordan, the Chief Operating Officer at Remix, and I do want to extend thanks and gratitude for having me on this panel because, as you mentioned, I'm not a Ross alum. I did matriculate at the Wharton program, and that's actually my story about using my voice. I was working full-time at Pacific Gas and Electric Company at the time and was accepted into the executive MBA program at Wharton in the San Francisco campus. And I had to come up with a way to get the PG&E execs to pay for it. So it took me a little while, but basically to Brett's point of just taking control of your own career, asking for what you want, and creating and making a business case to support it. I realized it had nothing to do about me as a person, but really around the business justification and the value that I could prove that PG&E would get as a result of paying for my education. So I was successful not only just sponsoring myself, but creating an MBA fellowship program that still exists to this day, where they sponsor specific programs. And I was just the first person that they gave it to. So that was my experience of just learning and putting myself out there. But as for Remix, what we do is provide software to transit agencies and local governments to help them visualize the right data to make better transit decisions. So providing transportation options to the people who need it most. So even though we are not a nonprofit, we are very much mission driven.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. If there's anyone from the Executive MBA program administration on this call, you might want to touch base with Nicole to find more people who can advocate at their company to pay their tuition. That's the kind of entrepreneurship I think we can all get behind. And President Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Professor Davis. I'm honored to be included in this important discussion today. Just a quick snapshot of the University of Colorado system that I lead. CU has roughly 70,000 students across 4 campuses and nearly 500,000 alumni worldwide. CU joins Michigan as 2 of the nation's 10 most prolific public research universities, and with our affiliate hospitals, we have an economic impact on the state of 14 billion. Well, I've been in academia for about a decade now. I spent a quarter in business following my MBA from Michigan and served terms in the US Congress. I attribute my approach to activism and my approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion to my mother. Growing up, every year on the first day of school, my mother would encourage me and my siblings to look for the new student in class and make them feel welcome. I've carried this with me over the course of my life and career. I attended a national conference with 1,500 other youth. Part of the Southern delegation showed up to the assembly waving a Confederate flag. Recognizing this as a hostile and perhaps frightening gesture for some of our participants, I challenged the flag waver and asked them to stop. That was the last time we saw that flag during the conference. When I was 21, in my first job after college, I was sent to a 2-week training course. I befriended a fellow trainee who is Jewish. As we ate lunch one day, another trainee joined us and, not realizing my friend was Jewish, started telling jokes about Jewish people. I challenged him as well, and I hope he learned a life lesson. While I continue to strive to live out my mother's advice, achieving true inclusion takes a lot more than just simply avoiding harmful symbols and words. It requires a sustained and collective organization-wide effort. It requires creating metrics to hold yourself accountable and work towards achieving those goals. And it requires ensuring an organization culture reflects the demographic reality of our nation and includes and celebrates diverse people and perspectives. Thanks for including me.
No, thank you so much. And your mother sounds amazing. That sounds like a great advice and a great start to life. So I wonder if we have the results of our poll ready. All right, looks like we got a normal distribution here. All right, panelists, any thoughts here?
Really balanced. More so, more so than I expected. I think that by and large, my experience is that people are pretty skeptical of corporate America's ability to follow through on things like this. So it's heartening that the group that's participating today has that level of faith in corporate America.
All right. Maybe we'll bring you around toward the end here, and maybe we can move the needle a little bit. Any other thoughts from the panelists? It did look pretty suspiciously balanced there.
Yeah, I read one survey that said only half of people in corporate America thought that their organization had a positive benefit on society. And I hope we can find ways for all organizations to have a positive benefit on society.
Yeah, that feels right. I mean, there are really some seeds of optimism out there. I don't know if anybody else listens to Kara Swisher's excellent podcast, Sway, from the New York Times, which she had an interview with the president of Microsoft yesterday. Highly recommended. It's really remarkable to hear the kind of steps that companies are taking to sort of engage in positive politics out there and getting their own employees involved. They reported that the company's political action committee now has an employee advisory board to tell them how they want their funds to be used, which I think is quite remarkable. So we're really entering into a new age here. Great. Well, let's dive into some of the questions here. And the way we're going to work this is we have one or two of the panelists who have volunteered for some of the questions, and we'll go through an arc. If others want to join in, we'll have a chance to do that as well. But the first question I want to start with Brett, which is, how do you make the case for DEI to a skeptic? So imagine you've got somebody that says, I don't really believe there's a business case for this, or I just think you're being PC. What do you say to persuade them?
Yeah, Jerry, once upon a time, the arguments that you'd have to use were purely anecdotal because the data wasn't there. There wasn't support for it. Now there's ample support for the fact that diverse organizations, diverse executive teams outperform non-diverse organizations and non-diverse executive teams. There's McKinsey and Company have published a fairly famous study and followed up on it, and others have done the same. So that data is available for people who are purely focused from a data perspective. But if you're having, for me personally, when I'm having that conversation with someone, and if it was someone here at United, then I would want to remind them of the nature of our business and our people and our customers. I mean, in a normal non-pandemic year, we fly 162 million passengers a year to 360 airports around the world. Our customers live in communities all around the world. Our employees live in communities all around the world. They are diverse, and by and large, they care about diversity. Our customers want to ensure that we are focused on it, and as a company, we want to ensure that our employees are bringing their best selves to work. So the value isn't always just in the numbers. It's in how you perceive things. It's in how your customers and your employees feel about you as an organization, and that's reflected in how we embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion as well.
Have you found yourself encountering a lot of skeptics around this, or has that case already been won?
Oh, I don't think the case has been won. No, not at all. I don't think as you look more broadly across the country, but and also with organizations of our size. I mean, we have, again, pre-pandemic, we're 90,000 employees. We are a microcosm, of the country. A lot of fantastic support here, and we're having amazing dialogue and doing some great things, which hopefully we'll talk about later. But we are convincing people as well. I mean, I think that's just part of the process, and I think we all have to embrace that and recognize that it's okay. We're all still on a journey.
Oh, fantastic. Brenda, what are your thoughts?
I think I would agree with Brett that I would point them to the data, because there has been so much research on this topic. And I would also ask this question, do you care about productivity? Do you care about creativity? Do you care about being culturally rich? And because all of these things affect the top line and bottom line. And there is a ton of research. I mean, I was reading a recent stat that said racially diverse teams outperform non-racially diverse teams by at least 35% when it comes to productivity. Bilingual employees bring in 10% more revenue for the firm than non-bilingual employees. And so just bringing in that diversity of thought creates innovation, and it creates a place of safety so that employees can give their best. And I would say safety is number one. There are many people who come to a firm and they don't feel like they can speak up and really have their voice be heard, because there's so many subtle ways that we're silencing employees now. And so I think as leadership, we need to be much more conscientious of that and making sure we're making a very intentional effort of bringing people who have diverse thought.
Oh, fantastic. If there are still any skeptics out there, we'll have to point to Scott Page, who's a faculty member now at the Ross School, and his wonderful book, The Diversity Bonus. If you do encounter any skeptics and they say, show me the evidence, show me some numbers, ideally show me some Greek letters and equations, Scott Page's book is a really thoughtful effort to do that, to explain just the broad benefits of diversity, both at the external level, at the internal level of mental models. We're all really made better off, according to Scott's research. Great. And Brenda, you mentioned inclusion, and Mark, you also mentioned that your mom was advocating for inclusion processes all the way through your years of school. I wonder if you could share some of the advice you might have about recruiting and inclusion for diversity. How do you build the best pipeline for talent? What practices have you found? We had a lot of interest among people sending in questions about just what works out there. And I would say there's at least one well-known tech company that sought to do a better job of connecting with HBCUs and maybe has not been as effective as they might be around that. So I'd love your insights about this.
Well, in academia, we use search committees to hire key positions, and to make progress in DEI, it's critical to have diverse search committees that receive unconscious bias training and prioritize building a diverse pool of candidates. When you select a recruiter, consider their past success or lack thereof in attracting diverse candidates. As you select candidates, stay focused on the job duties of the position you're trying to fill. As you develop leadership training programs, challenge yourself to find and cultivate diverse team members. You know, when we recruit students in higher ed, we find it's essential to reach out to less represented students in the middle or high school to first convince them that yes, college is for them, and then to help them prepare for success in college. You know, we're moving towards where we're treating higher ed as a private good, not a public good. It costs twice as much to educate an engineering or a technical degree as it does some liberal arts degree. When you pass it on to the student, it's harder sometimes for less represented students to progress in those because of the cost. Those are things that tech companies need to step forward and help with. And as we're trying to diversify our faculty, we find in fields like tech or business, we need to invest in building a more diverse pipeline of PhD graduates. People want to work for an organization that embraces a purpose that benefits society and the bottom line. That's a central theme of a book I wrote on business success in the age of activism. We've tied DEI directly to our mission at CU by making it one of our 4 pillars in our strategic plan. Current and prospective employees will seek an organization that shares their values, and they will watch the words and actions of their leaders, just as Brenda was saying. Consider the faces you include in your marketing campaigns, the messages you put out in the world. As president of CU, I'd say that more than half of what I speak about or write about mentions DEI. And of the first 9 hires at CU, 5 are women, 5 are of color, and 1 is a veteran. Those are the things you need to do to have successful recruiting.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that. And I did share a link in the chat specific to business schools. There's been a long, and Mark mentioned starting very early in the pipeline. So if you're looking for college students, go back to middle school. So you have to go pretty far back in the life cycle to make sure that you have a good pipeline. One way that business schools have approached this is through the PhD project, which aims to recruit more faculty of color by going all the way back to people who are undergraduate business students, MBA students, and try to persuade them that a career as faculty is a pretty good deal. And that's been a really effective, long-running program supported by KPMG and others to try to diversify the faculty of business schools. I wonder if we had any other thoughts. Maybe Nicole, if you had some thoughts about recruiting or inclusion?
Absolutely. I think recruiting is just a broad term, but I think that you kind of get what you measure. So you do have to track what actually occurs during your funnel as you're bringing in prospective employees. And again, it's not just who you hire, it's at the interview stage, how many people make it to the second round, how many people make it to onsite, who's on your interview panel, how many people actually make it to the offer stage. And then after you recruit them, how many people stay on, how many people of color get promoted, and how many people leave within a certain time frame. So again, I think throughout the entire employee cycle, you have to measure everything so that you can actually see what your success rate is. And usually companies will measure what's important to them. So I would encourage anyone who's talking to a firm or a company to ask questions around their retention and their processes for making sure that there is inclusivity. Because again, if you don't have a plan in place and you're not measuring success, then it may not be as important to them. But I just firmly feel that as leaders, it is our responsibility to create an environment and a culture where people can show up and be themselves. So it's one of those things that's intangible around how you treat your employees of color once you do have them on board. So I tend to focus more on the inclusivity part, because it's easy to just, go to an HBCU and try to recruit and throw money at the problem. But then once they're in your organization, how do you treat them and how do you develop them?
And do you have any sort of specific practices or thoughts that you could share? A lot of folks among our participants were wondering, like, what specifically could I do? Is there something that I could do at my company to make it feel more inclusive?
Well, there's so many different things you can try. I think a lot of it does boil down to also just how your manager and leaders treat their team. So there are ERGs, and there are a lot of formal things that a company can do. And by ERG, it's employee resource groups. So you can form and put a structure around employee resource groups and make sure that For example, right now our company's celebrating Black History Month. So there are all types of things that you can do to make people feel included. But a lot of it does really boil down to how the manager treats them in meetings, making sure that everyone in the room does have a voice, and making sure that the loudest people in the room are not the only people voicing ideas, and that people feel valued and that they are contributing. So to me, it always boils down to that individual connection with a manager or with a team in terms of how people treat you. But there are a lot of things that firms can do to just make sure that the infrastructure is there as far as ERGs, making sure that there's representative people on the panel when you're interviewing, making sure there's a buddy system or someone who can help you navigate a large organization. So there are a lot of tactical things, but again, like really measuring a manager's success rate and how they treat their employees of color is significant.
No, that's great. And you mentioned some really important things there, like monitoring rates of turnover, who gets promoted. Brett was saying when he led off that the opportunities for promotion were not always as universally widespread as they might be based on merit. And so these are some of the things that we can measure. Did people have any other thoughts about measurement? How do you know, what are the indicators to you that you have been successful? Like if you've got an initiative, what do you look to say, this is working, this is doing what I expected to, or we ought to have some concerns here? And I'm living in Silicon Valley for the year on sabbatical. And thank you, Brenda and Nicole, for being here. They are not universally successful as they might be. And a lot of times we get a report that says we can do better, we will do better, we must do better. And I'd like to know, what does better look like? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, so Jerry, I'll add that I think fundamentally a lot of entities, a lot of companies have been successful at getting people in the door, and not so great at development and promotion. So I think that you absolutely have to be spot on in terms of your recruiting practices. But then at the end of the day, what really matters is if you're looking at your organization from top to bottom, do you see people getting promoted? Are people occupying the highest levels of the company? And or do you see a funnel that starts very large at the beginning and gets smaller and smaller as you get to the top, which is pretty typical. I would argue that is an area that we really have to focus on collectively, and not a lot of entities, not a lot of companies are really good at it at this point in time. But we have to start talking really honestly about it and being really transparent about where we're successful and where we're not. And one of the ways that you do that is to start publishing your actual numbers, start to show your employee base and start to show everyone else where you're successful and where you're not, and what you're going to do to improve.
That feels like a scary proposition. So you go public with that information.
Absolutely. Well, at United, we just published the information internally to our employees, and we'll be publishing it externally as well. And from our point of view, there's some areas that we can feel proud of what we've accomplished, but it will also help set the table for the challenges that we have ahead of us and what we have to do, and everyone locking arms and understanding what kind of progress we need to make and where we've fallen short. I think in the absence of that kind of transparency, that type of information that facilitates discussions about what's been successful and what hasn't, then we're just gonna find ourselves back in the same place that we were in before, and that won't benefit anyone.
Yeah. And Mark, I wonder if you could share some insights here. So you gave some very impressive numbers on some initial hires, which sounded great. Where do we go from there?
Well, let me just first talk about where do we go from before there, because for Brett and other employers to have that pool of qualified people for their jobs, we need to be better at academia at not just attracting diverse students, but retaining and graduating them. And as you know, we have an equity gap in terms of that graduation rate. So it's important that we get increasingly better at that, particularly since, we're moving to a minority nation when it comes to high school graduates. And also for us to keep those, we need to do just what you're saying. They need to see their self reflected in the staff and faculty we have, in our curricula. They need to see their stories in their living and learning communities. They need to see buildings named after people named that are similar to their backgrounds. And that means that we need to get better at attracting underrepresented people to our faculty and staff. And as you know, in academia, that's particularly hard sometimes. But to move that, you need to make sure that you are having those inclusive environments and making sure that everybody feels welcome. One of the things that I firmly believe is that we need to do a regular survey of our employees and our customers, which in the case of university is our students. And at CU, we do this annually. And what it does is it helps us hold ourselves accountable, but it also allows you to target, where do you really have areas of opportunity where you can reach improvement? What specific group of individuals is not feeling included and welcome? And having that annual survey to measure your progress, to identify areas of improvement, helps you move just beyond the platitudes to specific actionable progress.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So we've been working at kind of an executive level in our conversation about what can you do when people reach the ranks that you all have, at very high levels in the organization. And I'm thinking about what advice would you have given to yourself a few years back, if you were sort of starting out in your career and you still want to advocate for change, that you've got some ideas that you want to advocate for, what kind of advice would you give to yourself? So we can even make this concrete. Like, let's say you have the idea that you want Juneteenth to be a corporate holiday, that June 19th is going to be celebrated at your company as a holiday, even if it's not a state or national holiday, it's something that's really meaningful to you. So what advice would you give to yourself a few years before? Brenda, you might be at a bit of a disadvantage since you just graduated 2 years ago, so you probably still remember what things were like, but what can someone who's not at the executive levels do to advocate for change?
Yeah, happy to answer that. I would say when you enter a room, speak up, question things. Don't be afraid just because you might be the youngest person or the most underrepresented person there, or, do not be intimidated by that, because I would argue that your fresh perspective is going to come in and bring just a different view that the company, didn't realize. Because sometimes you can get so narrow in terms of the company policy or the culture that you don't realize what's happening. And I would say some of the youngest activists in our society are making the biggest waves. I mean, even just a couple of weeks ago at the inauguration, Amanda Gorman, who was the poet, she speaks out always about race discrimination, and she's being heard. And then there are activists like Greta Thornton, who is speaking out about climate change. And she is only, I think, 19 years old, and she has her own organization that's working hard to reverse the impact of, all of the things that we've done to our climate. And so I would say that it is up to us. In this generation, especially, I would say it is, if you are in that position of privilege, you need to speak out. And for instance, like if you have a colleague who is underrepresented and doesn't have that same platform as you, then you should speak out on behalf of that colleague. Be an advocate.
Oh, fantastic. Other thoughts?
I'd be happy to offer my thoughts and some advice I got as a young student graduating from Michigan, and then come to the Juneteenth question, because at the end of the last period in my final semester for my MBA program here at Michigan, Professor Ray Riley gave us 3 pieces of advice. He said, when faced with the choice of cutting expenses or raising revenue, choose raising revenue. Secondly, be multifunctional, resist the temptation to remain in one function, finance, marketing, or otherwise. And thirdly, to be multinational, to find the opportunity to engage in international activities. And this advice has served me well, and I'm sure other graduates. And in following Professor Riley's precept to be multinational, I found that the best way to be more empathetic and considerate of historically underrepresented people is to live or work in a nation where you are the minority and you're the one who's having to answer the potentially awkward questions. But even if you're not doing much engagement outside, adopt a multicultural approach. Surround yourself with diverse people, including those whose journey to this moment, whose worldview is very different from your own. You will benefit greatly from this understanding, and I think it will help you perceive when there are others who are being made to feel uncomfortable by your actions or by those of others. And as Brenda says, you know, follow my mother's precept and do what you can to help them be at ease, to speak out for them. But I would also tell you that when you're looking to be a young person, as Brenda says, speak out. I ended up becoming a top 5 executive at a Fortune 100 company at age 31. And in part, I remember an experience where an older staff person at a company I worked at said, "You're going to tell the CEO he's," and I said, "Yes, I'm going to tell the CEO he's wrong because he is wrong. I'll do it in a nice, you know, polite, respectful way, but speak out." But the other thing, anything you're going to do, whether it be getting your company to take Juneteenth, the broader the coalition you build, the more different and the different perspectives and backgrounds that your coalition brings, the more likely you are to be successful in advocating for that. So build a diverse group of friends and contacts and perspective in life, and you will find that you will be more effective, whether it be advocating for Juneteenth or anything else you're advocating for in life.
So we're going to add this to Ray Riley's 3 excellent pieces of advice. Number 4 is going to be build a diverse coalition and nothing can stop you.
That is true.
Brett or Nicole?
Yeah, I would just add, I think those are Mark and Brenda, some excellent points. And I was just going to build on a point that Mark made. For people who are just starting their careers, there's real power in learning how to communicate these points effectively. And you should start at the earliest point that you can. But you know, do it in a way that builds support for your positions. Because if you think over the long term, how much you can accomplish within that organization and within others, once you build that skill set, once you build that muscle, your ability to advocate even on difficult and uncomfortable issues, there's remarkable power in that. And if you think about what you can accomplish over the course of your career, if you learn that lesson early, and as Mark mentioned, you know, you build your coalitions, you convince people to come along, but as Brenda said, you just have to be fairly fearless about it. But there's a way to effectively have those conversations that will benefit you and the people around you, and you will only get better at it.
So let me ask you this question. Suppose that now that you're the president, suppose that 31-year-old Mark Kennedy comes up to you and says, "You're wrong." Tell me how welcoming you should be in that situation.
Yeah. Well, it depends on if I have my coffee yet. But the reality of the matter is, it as I mentioned, it all depends on how you do it. It happens every day. And you know, with the people that I work with, if they don't have the courage to do that, then you know, then I can't be at my best either. So, you know, I love hearing from our most junior people in the organization who have a point of view that happens to be different. I just want it to be a dialogue. And at the end of the day, we can even agree to disagree. Title doesn't matter, experience doesn't matter. But what matters is the dialogue itself. And there's a way to do it to be effective, and there's a way to do it to have people shut off. And that, to me, that's the key to learn.
That's amazing that you're able to approach this with that kind of humility. So thank you for that.
I would just add that it's best if you're well informed when you bring that point of view. And if you have a diverse group of people that you bounce this idea off, it will sharpen that idea and make it better informed. But if you're at a leadership position, there's nothing you value more than people bringing diverse, different perspectives to your attention. If we're all thinking the same thing, one of us is not necessary. We need people to bring those different ideas to sharpen and hone the approach we're bringing. And I always encourage people to do it in a respectful way, but you'll find the true leaders at the top invite and respect. They may not agree, they'll think about it, it may adjust something they do later on, but they'll appreciate people bringing different views to them.
So it sounds like your advice, President Kennedy, is to not surround yourself by people who tell you how great you are. This is going to keep this in mind for the future.
It's very true.
That could
I have
be good
plenty of
advice
people
for.
tell me how great I'm not, so that's very helpful to me.
They've got tenure. It's a little bit safer there. And Nicole, did you have any advice to young Nicole, the straight out of college Nicole, for her career of activism?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on what Brenda said originally is just around using your voice and having confidence that your voice does matter, even if you can be very different. I have a slightly different view of from the leadership down and, requiring someone to be informed or requiring them to have done their homework. I think as a leader, you have to be ready to receive feedback in the way that people are able to give it to you, because sometimes they're not as well informed, or they may not have the polish or the skills to deliver a message. So I think part of our coaching and responsibility is to help them fine tune that message, but also to kind of hear them, even if it doesn't come in the way that we might want it. I've had sometimes very disrespectful either customers or employees come to me with something, and it's a tendency to just react. But once you unpack it and think about it and remove yourself from it and go back, there's sometimes a lot of truth and really good stuff that's in the feedback that's just not polished. It's like a little bit of a rough snowball that hit you. It was a rock inside that I wasn't ready for, but at the same time, the intentions weren't that bad. So I think as leaders, that's part of our responsibility.
Thank you for the snowball metaphor. I know you're in the Bay Area, and so your contact with snowballs.
I just made that up. I don't know.
You can roll with it. That's a pretty good one. All right, I do now at this moment want to advocate that everyone go off to advocate for Juneteenth. We're going to say that it started on this conversation, that Juneteenth as a corporate holiday began at this conversation. So check it out.
Actually, can I say something about Juneteenth?
Please.
After last year, there were a lot of companies that came out with public statements, and they mentioned that Juneteenth would be a holiday. And even at Remix, we made it a company holiday. But one thing I did notice was in some of those statements, they said this year. So if you really pay attention to some companies, they're like, this year we'll observe Juneteenth. So I challenge a lot of companies and corporations out there to make it a firm holiday that's every year, not just because of last year's social unrest. So at Remix, we made it a holiday for every year.
Thank you. No, that's great to hear. So Brett, I wanted to start with this, try this question on you first, and then others can join in. But what if you're advocating for something that really doesn't have a positive business case? What if you're advocating, so let's say that Juneteenth is, the right thing to do, but the numbers just do not add up. This is not going to get more customer butts in seats. This is not going to make United Airlines any money. It's probably going to cost something, but you feel strongly about it. How do you make the case for something that doesn't have necessarily the obvious business case?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we have to appreciate and frame the discussion in a way that doesn't make the business case all about the bottom line and all about money and the plan. So a business case to me has everything also to do with culture. It has everything to do with how our employees feel about the organization. And all of those things, Brenda did a fantastic job earlier of highlighting, innovation and how employees need to feel safe and welcome. All of those things that's a different type of currency for organizations. But it's every bit as valuable, and in some instances, given what we went through in the last year, it's even more valuable than the bottom line, because that at the end of the day is what allows an organization to stand up straight and make it through the most difficult times. It gives your organization resiliency. It feeds your culture. And so while it's not technically a bottom line issue and a business case in the general sense that we typically talk about it, it absolutely is, because it has everything to do with the health of the organization and the people within that organization and your culture. So frame the argument differently. Don't just accept the usual way of talking about it and just dollars and cents. It's broader than that, and it's much more important than that.
And I would just like to add on to what Brett was saying about it's a long-term investment. It might not be an immediate impact, but it's an investment in your people and your organization. And it's you showing as a leader that you're not just saying words, but you're taking action and that they can trust you. And trust is a currency. And if your employees don't trust that you'll do what you say to the public, then you can't build that culture. You can't build that, safety that I was talking about earlier. So I would say it's completely a long-term investment.
Great. Thank you for that. Let me move on to the next question. So a lot of companies are doing things in response to immediate events in the world. Like as Nicole said, this summer, a lot of companies said, we're celebrating Juneteenth this year. But how do you make sure that the changes that you make last beyond the current media cycle? How do you make sure that the things that you're implementing live on and become sort of part of a legacy? And Nicole, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. So yeah, I guess one step is by not having it just be for that year, but instituting policies that will last beyond the current media cycle. But I think it's also just, there's infrastructure and there's a lot of things that go into running a business, and making sure that you have diverse representation throughout every phase of that is something that can be long lasting. And it may not be as apparent to the general public if you're not a public company, but the things that you do behind the scenes will show up. So for example, who's on your board of directors, investing in making sure who's representative on your leadership team, just at all levels of the organization, making sure that you have diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that that will last beyond a news cycle, because these are people who are in the roles and are committed to driving and making decisions for the business going forward.
Oh, fantastic. And Mark, did you have some thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything Nicole said, but to make progress, we need to make sure we have metrics that are holding to that this year, next year, 5 years from now. And at CU, our strategic plan, about a dozen metrics, about a quarter of which relate to DEI. And these are things we come back to every year. I think the other thing you need to do is you need to keep your goals focused. Make sure DEI is among them. I try to keep my annual performance goals, and those are my reports, to 10 or less. And both for me and for my reports, I make sure that DEI are well represented within there. So be focused on what you're driving. Make sure DEI is part of what you're trying to achieve.
And Brett.
Yeah, I think all I can add to that is that I think there's another component of it, and I think it's that is owned by everyone in an organization, and that goes to the accountability element. And I think that we're all responsible for that. The senior leadership team is responsible for it, but the organization itself is also responsible for holding the leadership accountable. So a lot of promises are being made now, a lot of commitments, a lot of really fantastic statements. More so than at any point in my career, I feel better about it than at any point in my professional career. But it has to your point, it has to stick. And so we all have to be mindful of the need for there ultimately to be accountability for the things that we've all committed to. I have made commitments, our organization has made commitments. We need to be held accountable for that at the end of the day, that we do what we said we were going to do. and that at the end of the day, we make effective change in our organization and more broadly. And we should be held to account for that. And everyone, I think, holds some responsibility for ensuring that happens.
Great. So we got people, metrics, accountability. Brett, are you an optimist right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an opti-realist. But I feel better. I feel better today than I've ever felt about what we can actually accomplish. I really do.
Huh. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit. What's the source? So if I were in the airline industry right now, I'm an anxious person already. You've had a pretty challenging year.
Yeah. But you know, I think all the way around, what I feel great about is I see resilience, you know, and people. I mean, look at how the nation has changed. Look at how we've dealt with the pandemic. It hasn't gone according to plan, but people are getting through it. And you look at organizations, how organizations adapt, and you look at the response to everything that happened last summer and the social unrest that followed. And I feel very good about what we can actually accomplish when everyone sort of has their eyes wide open. And right now, I think we all have our eyes wide open. We won't accomplish everything that people have set out to do, but I think we're going to be in a better place. So across the board, I am optimistic about the future. It's just it is the way I feel.
I feel the same way that Brett feels. Because I think whenever you have any sort of change happen, there has to be an awareness of the need for change. And I really think that happened last year across the board in a way that I've never seen it before. So I think that was a strong catalyst, at least for people to open their eyes. Now, what people do with that information and the steps that they take in the future for making change is a different question, but at least the awareness I feel is there. And that makes me optimistic as well.
I'm going to say opti-realist is going to be my word of the year. So thank you for that, Brett. That's fantastic. So Brenda, I wanted to ask you a peculiar question coming off of this. So you are running a startup. Everything's new. You're creating the culture. You're right there, and you're creating the culture during a time where a lot of exciting things are happening all around you. In the Bay Area and all over the US and around the world. This is a very challenging time for that. What's different, or what are you doing, I guess, in building your culture and your organization to sort of reflect the moment that we're in and to try to reflect the values that you've been articulating in our conversation?
Yeah, so I think a couple things have really changed because of the last year. One is the fact that social change is on the forefront of people's minds, and the discrimination, the racial injustice, you know, the issues of our society as a whole, we've been kind of slipping under the rug and kind of ignoring and saying for tomorrow can no longer be for tomorrow. And so brands and companies now need to take responsibility, and we see that more and more as they speak up. But I believe, you know, that can't be enough. And so in our company, we are trying to enact policies where compensation and bonus is tied to meeting certain ESG goals or DEI goals. And so it's hitting your wallet. You know, you need to meet these metrics that we're saying are very important to us. You know, it's Nicole, it's what she said, you measure what's important to you as a company. And for us, that's very important. And so that's why we tie compensation with those goals. And the second thing is really utilizing this remote working from home. We've been able to tap into a very rich workforce all over the globe that we would have never had access to. Our team spans across 3 different continents right now, and we are learning from each other. Everyone speaks a different language, but you know, we're able to communicate, and our brainstorming sessions are that much more rich and fuller because of it. So I would say it's an opportunity. There have been terrible things that have happened, but it's an opportunity for us to really embrace the change and really start over in a lot of places where we've fallen short.
No, No, that's amazing. 3 continents is pretty impressive. And I think kind of all of us are feeling the same way, that we're able to draw together people from around the world in conversations like this. But it feels like it creates some real challenges. So inclusivity, uh, Ingrid was just mentioning in the chat, belongingness. How do you create that feeling of inclusion or belongingness when the workforce is dialing in and they're on Zoom calls and they got a kid screaming in the background and their dog just made a mess on the floor? And I mean, how do you, if you can't really be in the room with someone to feel whether they're, whether they're connected? I don't know how you all have dealt with that. Maybe Nicole, if we have not mentioned COVID yet, by the way. We made it 1 hour into this conversation before bringing up the C word, which is kind of remarkable in current circumstances. But how do you mesh the demands or the need to be diverse and inclusive with a workforce that's spread all over the place, where you can't have necessarily the face-to-face or the heart-to-heart? What does inclusion look like in that world?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll mention COVID then, because I think that's what started a lot of this work from home culture. And what happened was, at the start of COVID and the start of the pandemic, a lot of people on the team handled it differently. There's some people that are introverts that were kind of relieved that we can work from home and you don't have to interact with people as much. And then you have extroverts that drive on energy and interacting with their peers that were actually going through depression. So we had to, as a company and as a leadership team, just start to unpack and make it a safe space for people to discuss how they're feeling and say that it's okay to not be okay, and talk about mental health and depression and how we're all different and how we're all managing and checking in with each other because of COVID. And then, of course, with George Floyd and all the social unrest, it just amplified the conversation and amplified the intensity of how people were feeling in terms of the disconnection and just the mental health and the sanity. So we instituted Remix Mental Health Days, where it's one thing, we do have unlimited PTO. So it's one of those things where it's kind of weird. Like, you have unlimited PTO where everybody can take whatever time off. But the reason we did the mental health days was because the entire company would shut down. It's one thing to take a day off and everyone else is still working and you have to catch up, or you feel guilty because you're missing out on meetings. But when the whole company takes a break, you have freedom to actually take a break also. And so we just instituted about once a month a mental health day where everyone just takes some time to invest in themselves, to discuss how they're feeling. We added more mental health resources and we added space to discuss everything that was going on. We put it on the calendar, and it was one of the employees' suggestions to do a candlelight vigil for the Black lives that were lost. So we did that. Like, we have to create space for mourning, for grieving, for discussion, and things that are non-work related, but things that really impact everyone on the team, to make sure that they can bring their whole selves to work when it is time to do the work.
No, thank you for that. That everybody gets a mental health day sounds amazing. So that feels like an amazing innovation. So thank you for that. I love it. Mark, I wonder if I could ask you. So I think airline president feels like probably one of the hardest jobs in the world today. University president also would be pretty high on my list. I do not envy those of you that are still wearing ties to work and overseeing students that want a tuition refund and faculty that don't want to show up on campus because it doesn't feel safe. And as you know, this is a challenging time, but also feels like a time where, at some level, if everyone is used to doing everything on Zoom, education and work can be a lot more, in principle, inclusive, because people can call in. They don't have to show up in Boulder, Colorado to take a class. We got students that are, living in Florida, in Orlando, taking classes from remote. So in some sense, the situation opens up the accessibility of education. And yet, when we do that, we realize you do not feel included when you're on a Zoom call from, your parents' spare bedroom. I'm wondering if how you've been thinking about sort of inclusion, and how do you create that feeling of community in a world that is so dispersed, both for, just for the whole community, I guess.
Well, it is very hard. And I would just say, as relates to the mental health, as we've compressed semesters to take out sort of a spring break or a Thanksgiving because you don't want them to go away and come back during COVID, we've consciously set in days where you have a 3-day weekend for the students to do just what Nicole was saying. But I do think that online is going to help us reach more. Now, recognize that what we're delivering right now on many campuses is often on campus delivered digitally as opposed to made for online with that student experience in mind. And I believe I don't know if I've got the place to quote this from, but that there's as many students with children, many college students with children, as there are students living on campus. So we have this metaphor of living on campus, which we of course have the best campuses on the planet up in the Rockies, but we need to be reaching out to, but you need to create community. One of the things I did when I was leading a college at George Washington, where half of our students were online, half were on campus, is I created a weekend in the fall and in the spring where we had a jam-packed full of activities where we're bringing in our best guest speakers and our professors to have experience for these online students to mix with our on-campus students. Michigan does a fabulous job of doing this. You bring them in for a football game when you got extra tickets, like when you're playing Purdue or something like that, and you give them an extra ticket too. So to create those opportunities, and where I see is that we're going to move away from online and on-campus blurring, and you're going to be delivering online what is best delivered online with perhaps some adaptive learning tools that know what they don't know, what learning style suits them best. But then you're also going to be having them bring it on campus for rich experiences. And we're going to move beyond degrees because not everybody necessarily needs a degree, or a degree may not last them for a lifetime, so they need to get a refresher. But I believe that some of the biggest angst we're feeling in the nation right now is because not everybody feels that technology is benefiting them. And that's a failure on all of our parts. And we need to figure out different ways of packaging credentials so that people can get that first rung on the ladder, and those at age 40 find themselves sidestepped by technology to get them back on a track to success. So it's something I'm very passionate about, and we need to come up with the right mix of experiences and training and knowledge transfer that can help prepare more and more of our society to benefit from the technology that this pandemic has only accelerated.
Oh, fantastic. I love your vision for this. So thanks for sharing that. That makes a ton of sense to me. So I've gotten lots of questions coming in. I did want to run this one past the panelists and see if you had any thoughts on this. So we're asked, what are your thoughts on middle management employees and their ability to drive the career progression of diverse recruits and organizations? Should they get special training, I guess, as mentors? Should a component of their performance factor in developing more diverse employees?
I'd say yes and yes. It's hard to do, particularly when you are in a financial crunch imposed by the pandemic and other things. But this does not come naturally to a lot of people. And having an extensive level of training in a variety of ways for not just middle management, but otherwise as to how to do that makes sense. One of the most impactful interviews I had, I was interviewing for a job one time, and the person interviewing me said, give me one experience of how you've developed somebody to progress in their career. Not how you develop you, but how you develop somebody to progress in your career. And you will find that type of a skill set, to be thinking about how can I develop others, is something that will solve a lot of societal problems if we can figure out how we do a better job at that. It's not easy, it's expensive, but it is something we need to do a better job of.
Yeah. I would also add that my guess is in a number of organizations, what you find is that middle management and up is where you start to see the numbers start to drop off. So I think in a lot of organizations, that is one of the most important places to ensure that you are investing in support for management and training and are actively engaging so that you don't end up with a bit of an artificial ceiling in the middle of your organization. because I think that especially in larger organizations, I think that tends to happen.
I completely agree. And I think I completely agree, Brett, because it's middle, but it's also the executive team needs to be trained as well so they can help coach middle management. So I think there's training all around. I think for an extensive leadership team, everyone who's a leader should be trained in unconscious bias and any other leadership curriculum you have. You need to add in the diversity and inclusion work as well.
Oh, great. And we did have one last question I wanted to try before we head towards the close here, which is, what advice would you give smaller organizations to prioritize identifying diverse pools of candidates when there's a timely need to fill an open position? And maybe Brenda, if you were willing to weigh in on that one, given that you've been recruiting people from 3 continents, it sounds like you got some good experience there.
Yeah, I mean, normally we would go through, the process of always finding the best candidate. We're not looking to fill quotas here. We're not looking to fill numbers here. And that's something that I found at many other firms where I'd literally be in a recruiting meeting and they would be like, you should just pick out at least 10 women resumes and then from there we'll choose one. And yeah, I'll leave that there. But, there's a lot of those moments that I had. And I think coming into my startup, being very conscious of that and also providing opportunities that you wouldn't normally give. For instance, we have one member of our team who was a mother and had been out of the workforce for 10 years. And she was very hesitant about rejoining the workforce. And I felt like it was the perfect opportunity for us to kind of take into action what we've been saying. And so we've kind of helped her and given her training in a lot of technical skills. She's now able to fully lead a team of developers on her own and still take care of her child at home. And so I really think it's an opportunity for us to consider people we normally wouldn't.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So we're closing in on the end. We did a survey at the beginning of this panel about your optimism about the corporate sector and its ability to engage in change. And now we want to try that survey again to see if anyone changes their mind. So once again, the question, after hearing from our panelists today, how confident are you in the business world's ability to make social change? You might say, have you become an opti-realist? And while we're tabulating those, I want to give the panelists a chance to sort of share their final thoughts after our conversation and what you've been seeing over the last year, what adventures you have ahead, and if you have any thoughts for, just what the world is going to look like going forward. And Nicole, I wonder if we could start with you.
Oh gosh. Well, this panel has been great. I will say that it's great to have so many different, even diversity on this panel in terms of just years of experience and backgrounds and how everyone can contribute in their own way. So I'm inspired about the future. I also kind of want to echo on a point brought up earlier around culture. I think that the culture of an organization matters so much and people make the culture, but really defining what culture you want and having the partnerships with community organizations that can serve, like Mark was saying, starting with middle school and younger organizations like that. You have to start early and those relationships will just help you in the long term. So even, for example, the last question around a diverse pool of candidates, you shouldn't try to start looking for diverse candidates when a job opening is there. You should have those partnerships and relationships already around so that when you do have an opening, you can quickly tap people that are in your network. So yeah, so I'm very optimistic about the future, like I said before, and I think that this panel has helped me even feel more confident just knowing that we're contributing in different ways.
Oh, fantastic. So centrality of culture and build the relationships well in advance. So thank you for that. Brett, I wonder if you had any thoughts you'd like to share.
Well, I just say thank you to everyone. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to share the microphone with you. And I've learned from this conversation, so I'm very appreciative of that. I would just say to folks, I think now is the time to be as deliberate as possible. We really still are in a very interesting space where I think we can make the most of this moment, both in communities, but also in the organizations, and frankly, for those of us who are raising families with our families and our discussions. And I think that in every respect, we just have to be as direct and as transparent and as deliberate as we can to engage in the discussion and to decide, what changes we want to make in our organizations and in our communities, and just be a real part of making that happen. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I really appreciate all your remarks.
And thanks so much for joining us. And I really appreciate your optimism. You really made me feel better about my day and my year. So thank you so much. Brenda, some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I can say I'm an optorealist after this panel discussion. I feel much more confident in businesses to continue this momentum. And I think that's important, that we continue to stay engaged and that it's not over. This fight is a journey. And, not to be a cliche, but, it is a marathon. We're not sprinting somewhere. And so I would say, really take it step by step. Raise your hand in small things. Participate in small, meetings and conferences, and, help shape that culture, because it does make a difference. And I think little things add up to something big. And so I would just encourage people to, continue forward, and that it will get better.
No, thank you so much for that. The work continues. And Mark.
Well, I would say that perhaps I'm the only one that was around during the 60s, the last time we had a major civil rights agitation. And I was young at the time, but I saw what happened afterwards. And to borrow Nicole's snowball, analogy, having been born and raised in Minnesota, the thing about snowballs, when you get them going, they get bigger as you go. They wrap more and more around them, and it gets bigger and more impactful. So I would agree with Brenda. It's little steps. Just think of that as a push of that snowball that gets bigger and bigger and starts rolling down the hill and make great progress. So we've seen some breaking of rigidities in recent times. And I think as that snowball goes along, we're going to be seeing more progress, hopefully, in the years ahead. So I'm going to stay an optimist.
Wow. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Maybe we could share the results of the poll and see if we have some other. Yes. 51% fairly confident, 18% completely confident. I'm willing to take that and say we've got our metrics and we can declare success and victory for this conversation. We've also got some marching orders. Go out and advocate for Juneteenth. We've got a great metaphor there, which is the snowball, Nicole's snowball, which is, and Mark's addition there. We need to roll that thing and build it up. And as Brenda said, small steps add up. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation. We will be posting in the chat a couple of additional resources. President Kennedy has written a lovely book about activism and how executives can deal with it. I got my own book as well. You can check that one out. Both of those will be pasted in the chat. But thank you to the panelists. I know you can't see it, but we all want to give you a hand for joining us for this important conversation and advancing our understanding. And thank you so much on behalf of the Ross School. And as always, go blue.
Go blue.